Welcome back to Senior Savvy Cannabis. I'm Katherine Goldberg. Today, we're joined by Dr. Codi Peterson, whose research is getting quite a bit of national attention. So, Dr. Peterson, before we jump into your research, how it was conducted, what you studied, I have to ask you a question. I
Please.
published a blog post from an audience member's question. She wrote that when she uses cannabis that has been organically grown, that all of a sudden she's been experiencing some nausea and she's worried that maybe she's at the very beginning stages of CHS. So I linked your research and said, perhaps I'm going to have Dr. Codi Peterson on. We'll ask him. The response I got from the industry, oh my God. So,
Welcome.
from an industry leader, well respected across all fields, right? He sends me an email and says, you fell for the propaganda, do better.
Mhm.
So, I'm curious if you have gotten any of this response. And if so, can we talk about why people are so defensive about this topic? There's something going on under the surface.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of angles that I want to take this on. So
Like,
so I think like the first angle that we have to have a conversation about is right now we're talking about something bad about cannabis or something negative associated with cannabis. And for a long time we were fed a lot of lies about cannabis and how what the negative things it did. And in addition to that, we're in a media environment that is really hyper focused on the negatives and really doesn't run with the positive research, but really hypes up this negative research. So people can feel that, particular people who have been in the community, have tremendous relationships, deep relationship with the plant, and it has done amazing things for them or their loved ones. And so people are getting defensive, and I totally get that. Um, if you look back at any content I've ever made, anytime, any interview I've ever done, anything I've ever written, I'm always a proponent of cannabis, particularly whole plant cannabis. And I keep that today. I maintain that. But that doesn't mean that even whole plant, organically grown, non-tainted weed, when consumed in the wrong person or at the wrong frequency, some mismatch between your life, your current state of health, and your cannabis consumption, that something negative could happen. Like that, those don't have to be separate things. And for some reason, we do see a lot of pushback within stakeholders in the cannabis community against the idea that CHS could be anything other than pesticide or anything other than it's actually the cannabis or something in the cannabis. It's tainted. There's mycotoxins. It's just cheap distillate, whatever you want to say. People really don't like that idea that it could be the actual weed itself. It could be a mismatch between you and the cannabis, the plant that you're consuming regularly.
before we jump into specifics, can you just tell us about this particular study that was just published and the survey you conducted and what you asked and who answered it? Because I think I definitely sort of had this idea of it's a certain kind of young man who
Mhm.
is dabbing all day, who maybe is more on the side of getting CHS. But it seems like that's not necessarily the case. That is it more men who develop this syndrome? Is there, I'm just
Yeah.
curious
Yeah. You're asking about the demographics.
Yeah,
Yeah,
let's
yeah.
flesh
So
that out.
I want to back up and address the study.
Please.
So, myself as lead author and a couple other tremendous industry stakeholders published on the paper, including Riley Kirk, who's been tremendous in helping us get the word out, and Megan Bang. Sorry, Megan. These creators and have been out here in the community talking about this and been getting a lot of flack. But the reason we're getting that's off topic. Let's get to the what I was trying to say. We did this because we've seen this in real time. We know individuals who've developed this condition. They're coming to us and saying, "Hey, I'm having this vomiting condition. I've tried X, Y, or Z. I grew my own cannabis. Maybe it's I just recently switched to vape pens. Maybe it's I actually pulled cannabis away and I had this vomiting. Either way, we all saw this vomiting condition from a different angle, and we said, let's try to understand who these individuals are better. Because right now, we don't know what's causing this vomiting condition associated with cannabis, has been dubbed cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome. So, cannabinoid, the stuff found in cannabis, hyperemesis, lots of vomiting. Syndrome is a collection of symptoms. And so these symptoms include nausea and vomiting, but also some other well, we wanted to find out what else. What else do these individuals experience, and how can we better understand what their use patterns are? What are they consuming, right? Is it just garage disty? Is it just the hemp market crap and the legal market's fine? Or is it just the legal market and the legacy guy, the old plug, old faithful, his weed is fine? We just wanted to know what was happening. So we went to the communities where these individuals are, not strictly to these communities, but that's where most of our recruitment came from. We went to the CHS communities on Facebook and we said, hey, come take our survey. Tell us everything about your experience with CHS. And we were proud to recruit about 1,134 people is who we included in the final analysis, who either been diagnosed with CHS by a doctor or believe they have CHS. So I will be the first one to admit that that's a flaw, right? It'd be ideal if we could have a verified diagnosis and be confident that who's in there. But we knew that that would be a really hard lift. So we went ahead and enrolled anybody who either thinks they have CHS based on the doctor's opinion or based on their own personal assessment. We then issued them a gamut of questions, like just when did you start using? How much did you consume? How did you consume? Where do you get your weed? Do you help? Do hot baths help? Do hot showers help? Those come next survey publication. But we asked them just a bunch of stuff. What is your sex? In our survey, we ended up recruiting about 70% women, which was higher than expected. But this could be a recruitment bias as well. In fact, all of the authors on the study, other than myself and the statistician Ryan, are females, and they helped alongside the recruitment. So that could be it. It could be that women are getting CHS more. We don't have any evidence of that. That's not what we were aiming to measure. And then to kind of jump away from sex, age, you kind of said, really targeting young people. We didn't specifically address anyone under the age of 18, but actually our largest cohort of people was between 24 and 35, so sort of middle-aged. And considering the fact that we asked them, how long have you been consuming before you started to get this vomiting condition? There was a good chunk of people, probably like a whole third of people who've been consuming more than 6 or 7 years. So that lines up with that sort of middle-aged cohort. And so, yeah, we asked all these individuals questions and we just were publishing the results and what we found. We really went into this just trying to understand like the picture of like who this is that's getting it, so that hopefully we can come up with better questions in the future about what we need to actually test and analyze. The study was not to find the cause or make an accusation of the cause of CHS. We just published what we found about the individuals who responded to the survey.
And what did you find?
Yeah, we found that these people smoke a pretty hefty amount of THC-rich cannabis. We mostly saw smokers and vapors. People who reported only edibles were pretty uncommon, although they did exist. There was only about 30 of them, I think, by the time we got down to people who only said they consumed edibles when they got this. So inhalable dosage forms were implicated. Smoking flower was the most common, so that kind of pushes back against the idea that it's just isolate or distillate chemicals. But we also saw vaping, we also saw dabbing, we saw Delta 8 THC, which is sort of from the hemp industry. We saw people with THCA flower in states where THC is illegal and THCA isn't somehow. We're not going to get into that right now, but those are the
Little
same thing.
loophole? Right.
Yeah. And so, yeah, we saw individuals consumed most commonly every day. 98% of everyone who responded to our survey consumed cannabis every day. About two-thirds, 66% of them consumed more than 3 times a day. Half consumed more than 6 times per day. About half, it was 45%. So we saw a regular THC consumer who usually consume for quite a long time, usually 3 or more years before they ever started getting this vomiting condition. Um, yeah, that's some of the things we found.
Absolutely fascinating. And I'm so thankful that it's someone like you who does believe in the plant. You're not
Mhm.
you're not trying to you're just asking questions because it would be doing
It's
a disservice to the people who are suffering if we didn't ask these questions. And out of people who consume cannabis, let's say every day, um, would you say that it's less than 5% of people who may lean in the direction of developing CHS? I know we can't pinpoint that down
yeah,
exactly, but I it's still it's obviously a small percentage. It's not none, but
yeah.
how I consume cannabis every day. It's been more than 6 years.
Mhm.
So I imagine there's
Right.
some
Are you a
genetic.
freak or are you a time bomb? Like that's the implication is like we're all on this cliff. And the answer is I don't know. I know that there are some pretty bombastic numbers that have been proposed, and I think there's some more realistic numbers that have been proposed. My gut is that it's less than 5%, just based on I know 20 stoners, and I don't think any of them are hiding the condition in which I'm pretty prominently advertising that I'm an expert in. Sticking my neck out to have a conversation, and I don't have that many people coming to me. But rest assured, I've bumped into individuals. I teach at a paramedic school in Southern California, in addition to all the other weed stuff I do. And I'm an emergency medicine pharmacist by training by night. Literally last night, I was at the hospital, you know, dealing with patients who have seizures, get hit on their bicycles, whatever. I'm the pharmacist in the ED. That's what I do by night. And yes, sometimes I see cannabis related things like CHS. So that's what really inspired me to go look into this because this is not some make believe situation. I've got physicians, my peers, people I trust to save lives with children next to me saying, this kid's vomiting from the weed. And so then I'm having, with all the context that I have, having these in-depth conversations with kids. And yeah, there really does appear to be this vomiting thing that's coming up, not just with vapors, sometimes with people on edibles, but not just with, like, there's just not any cohesion here. So I knew it was real and I wanted to get to the bottom of it. So, that was part of the impetus of this study. What were you asking me that got me on that tangent?
I don't remember,
Ah,
but
ah.
like,
Oh, what percentage of people?
oh,
Okay.
you said you think it's
Look,
less than
there's a lot
5%.
of
Yeah.
teenagers who consume cannabis, and I can tell you that I don't see that many of them, right? This is not a dime a dozen. There's a flood of these patients banging at my door. But it happens. And those individuals, they get their weed from the same place as their peers do. And why aren't their peers getting sick? And we don't really have the answer to that. But the best evidence that we have right now that suggests is like what's going on here is likely that it's a overlap of your sort of your use, how much cannabis, how often, what are you using, what dosage form, but all on top of your genetics, right? Like some individuals we have evidence to say that there's a genetic predisposition. There's one published paper that says five different sort of random SNPs that might be associated with worsening outcomes. I think we've got
Hmm.
that going on. And then I believe we also have a layer of stress and changes in modern environments that is putting us all under a peculiar amount of stress, whether it's the social media environment, the internet age, what I don't know. But I think that those three things are all coming together to really facilitate this way. And eh, I don't think most of us are at risk of getting CHS, but I do wonder to what extent any of us could develop it. It's just that there are some people that are far more disposed and some people that are extremely resistant to this, like for lack of a better example, the Snoop Dogs of the world, right? Who just can consume to no end for extended periods of time. So I think that's probably more what we're looking at is a side effect that could happen to most anyone, but for most of us, we have the resiliency systems built in. Our health otherwise is good enough, and that when those things start to fail, those people who are genetically predisposed are starting to get this vomiting condition. With use that would otherwise be considered somewhat normal, as you mentioned. I had individuals reporting just one use per day who got this syndrome.
You
Much less
talk
common, by the way. Much less common than six or more times per day.
it it seems like moderation is a good thing to bring back in general. Um, But in terms of I advocate for the whole plant. I think once you break down the plant matrix, you're asking for trouble, to be perfectly honest. I don't like distillate. But with these extremely high THC percentages at the cost of having no minor cannabinoids. Do you think that, because the response I got also in that blog post, someone said, well, humans have been smoking hash for thousands of years. Well, why didn't it exist back then? The hash a long time ago was like 10% THC.
Maybe more than that, but also we only identified what THC was. We only started breeding for THC in the last 50 years, right? We didn't know what it was. So people might have even been breeding, but honestly, no. Most of the cannabis that was grown throughout history was wind pollinated and growing in fields. That's where land races came from. These are not being bred by two people. We're not selecting that plant. But putting that aside, it still wouldn't have been a high THC cultivar per se, right? I mean, they might have selected for ones that were more psychotropic, but only in the recent breeding time have we gotten to these plants that make all the THC and absolutely nothing else. And so I think that might be part of what's contributing to this thing as well. You know, historically we thought plants would be protective here, but we saw people just smoking, right? So not the only breakdown of the plant matrix is the burner there. And we saw those individuals get CHS as well. So, you know, I think it is funny that we really hate pharma. The cannabis, the industry is like really anti-pharma. But we've spent a long time cultivating a plant trying to really hone it in for one molecule. And I think that we need to take a step back and go, "Well, maybe we need more heterogeneity in this plant, and we should look at what these genetics and the way we've selected for these really good THC producers, these really fast turnovers, and what was lost in the process. I think that there might be some truth in that, but again, I don't think that's the sole issue. I think the sole issue is we've got way more people consuming way more cannabis than we ever have in the history of the planet, just by sheer numbers. It's never been more available. It's never been more acceptable to get stoned all day. And so I just think we're seeing more and more of this bubble to the surface. That doesn't mean we should go back. It doesn't mean that alcohol is better. It doesn't mean we need to illegalize cannabis or ban cannabis. What it means is that, yes, moderation is an important habit. Nothing in this world is perfect, not even this wonderful herb that proves so much medicine for so many people. And that if we educate people rather than deny its existence, we can actually probably intervene faster and people could start to recognize symptoms, moderate their use, and change their behavior. Maybe it's not their use. Maybe it's the other things they're doing in their lives. Maybe they need to integrate mindfulness or breath practices to reinforce their endocannabinoid system. I'm not out to get your weed and call it the boogeyman, but I do want to understand what's happening to these otherwise healthy individuals who are just starting to vomit uncontrollably. So that was the goal of the survey, is to try identify who those people are and what they look like, so to speak.
And I hear these horror stories of people going from doctor to doctor, from appointment to appointment for years, not being able to put together the dots when they say if someone had just told them that this condition could possibly exist, they would have just stopped smoking and been fine. So
That's absolutely happening, and it's horrible, and it can go on for years. A lot of times, people chase issues for decades, right? They have these episodes, they don't really know what it is. I have personal emails about this. I want to flip that over and address the other side too. There are a lot of individuals who've relied on cannabis for a long time who continue to get benefits, who get sick with diverticulitis or kidney stones or whatever, and get immediately shunted into this bucket, or just have a really complicated clinical picture who are getting sort of slapped with this label, given an antipsychotic, because that's the drug we give you in the emergency department for the vomiting associated with this.
oh
It's called
no.
Haldol, yeah. And kind of put in that bucket and sent down that camp. And then if you come back again, oh, now you're even more quickly put in that bucket. And so there is both sides of this coin. And that's what we want to get to the bottom of. We want to teach doctors when not to suspect it. If someone's consuming cannabis once a day, that already puts them much less likely to be this CHS patient. If the individual's experiencing these symptoms for a long time, has been smoking cannabis for a long time, they've had multiple workups, and it's probably more likely the cannabis, and that we need to take a real break in order to find out what's going on. Some people don't
What
believe their diagnosis. Some people get worried about being sick and thinking it's CHS. So there's just so much fear and sort of lack of understanding. And I think that's what we need to address.
if people stop using cannabis and give their body time to reset, months, have you heard of some of them being able to go back and use in moderation? Or is this sort of the speculation I think that people have is that if I have this condition, that's it for the rest of my life?
Okay, the textbook says yes, you have to quit forever. That's what
Okay.
the textbook says. The real world is not a textbook. The real world is filled with layers, and there have been numerous accounts of people who have done that, and I respect their worldly experience. There are more who cannot, who, for one reason or another, often it's not that okay, let's say you developed CHS, Catherine, and you took a 6 month or 12-month break. You could go back to THC and probably not vomit. You could smoke and not get sick. You could probably smoke today and tomorrow, maybe even a couple times next week and be fine. But it has a tendency to creep back in, even if you never get back to your use pattern. If you do go back to your same use pattern, that's my counseling point to my patients,
Mm.
it's pretty much it's gonna happen, right? So your body has shown you the line. You need to let the body recover and heal. And then if you do come back to cannabis, you need to respect that line. You need to respect your body and its feelings. And yes, there are individuals who this is not a forever thing, but it's usually a forever you're not going to go back to the way you were consuming. It does appear to I don't fully understand it. No one fully understands it. There seems to be some sensitization going on. You'll see people on the internet say it's an allergy. Doesn't really line up. Again, as a pharmacist and working in an emergency department, we see a lot of different types of allergies. This doesn't really line up with that in the traditional sense of the word. But it is an intolerance that's developed. But often people will go back to weed after 8 months or 9 months off and be able to tolerate it for a while. Some individuals, not at all. And that they sort of, it just doesn't sit with them anymore. So it's kind of a crapshoot right now. We still don't know what causes it. There's some speculation on the internet right now that it could even be vitamin deficiency. Again, I don't have the evidence to support that it's not. I'm not really convinced by that theory either. I see no harm in trying to replete vitamins, especially in someone who's been vomiting for a long period. So I don't have an objection to those strategies, but we didn't find this is still a question for everyone is how do we best treat this? What I can tell you is in the emergency department, we're going to try to hydrate you, which prevents the most dangerous side effects. Usually dehydration and cardiac events associated with it is what really is bad for people. Um, and then we're going to give you a medicine, try to break the episode. And if we can break it, we're going to try to send you home because that's what the emergency department does. It addresses emergencies and then it either puts them in the hospital if they need it or sends them home. Some patients will get admitted to the hospital. They'll stay there for 7 or 10 days because they can't keep anything down. They'll just keep vomiting. They're not touching weed. They're not doing that, but they're just continuing to vomit. It's tough. We're trying all sorts of medicines, and a lot of them don't work. We're working through what are some of these good options? But this is a real challenge in healthcare.
Seriously.
Hmm.
Um, I know that your study didn't look at the mechanism, but can we just broadly talk about, let's say there is a genetic component. Would that genetic component make those people more like, would their sensitivity to the CB1 receptor be like more sensitive? So that's why the same amount is affecting them? Or am I sort of how do we, how do,
Yeah.
how do you think about the genetic component without actually knowing the
Okay.
nuts and bolts of it?
Yeah. So there's only been one study, and it was
Okay.
small that looked at the genetic component, but they did find potentially six. We'll call them risk factors. If you these six things were more common in the vomiters than not. Maybe some people have that, but I think it's probably a component of all of this. There is the current test, the one that was developed for that study, is not necessarily available, and the common genetic tests are not looking for these SNPs. So this is not really part of the common DNA technology that we're talking about every day. But we do believe that there's just this genetic factor, but it's not just about CB1 receptors. So what we found in the study is almost everyone was taking a CB1 receptor agonist, an activator of that receptor, but then the genetic things had little to do with the CB1 receptor and had to do with other parts of potentially the endocannabinoid system or even just our normal dopamine signaling. So the genetic abnormalities we expected to look and find changes in the receptor, and actually that wasn't what they ended up finding.
Interesting.
Um, Look, I think CHS is a complicated thing, and introducing THC chronically into the body is bound to have some dysregulating effects. For some people, maybe they were baseline dysregulated and therefore THC helps. And it may help forever, or maybe in some people, chronic exposure or changes in circumstances, changes in hormones leads to a change and it no longer sits with them. So I don't know exactly what's causing 10 years later this condition to pop up in individuals, but it's reasonable to think that it is an imbalance in the endocannabinoid system. That is one of the primary hypotheses induced by exposure to THC. Exactly how in the system that's happening, it's kind of getting into the weeds of it and doesn't really matter at this point. But there are other theories that I want to give credence to. Dysregulation of your HPA axis, your stress axis,
Mhm.
has been proposed as part of the mechanism, which lines up with some of the cyclical nature. We see one thing we found in the study was people often experiencing prodromal symptoms. This is symptoms that are not vomiting before the vomiting phase. Those can go on for extended periods of time, weeks or months, waking up every day feeling crappy, having diarrhea, having like maybe like a gag but not a vomit.
Mhm.
Um, we see that in a lot of individuals, and we see that particularly in the morning. So we think that circadian-ness of that has to do with that stress signaling that I kind of just alluded to. There's another theory that it's mycotoxins from contaminated cannabis. So there are certain organisms that are pretty prolifically growing in commercial cannabis production. Fusarium is one of those. Aspergillus is also on a lot of people's radar. But those fungi, they can create a mycotoxin that's literally known as vomitoxin. And there is one theory going out there that it's vomitoxin that's showing up, or something like it, that's showing up in the cannabis, and that's why people are getting sick. That's a fine theory. Doesn't make a lot of sense to me because people can smoke the same weed and one gets sick and one not. And often individuals they do not smoke this cannabis and start vomiting, which is a much more vomitoxin
Mhm.
response. What's happening is they're smoking cannabis, they're not doing anything, and usually it's the next morning or the next day that they're getting sick, maybe even the next day after that that they start to have this vomiting episode. So it's not this straightforward response between I smoke cannabis and I vomit, which would be really easy for people to quit. If people just said every time I smoke weed I feel ill, they would stop. But that's not what's happening. Every time they smoke cannabis, they feel a little bit better. They feel a little bit less off than they did, but then they wake up the next day and go through the similar cycle and they grab cannabis and maybe it helps, maybe it doesn't. They just sort of have low level gurgliness until one day maybe they had a drink the night before, maybe they went hard with their friends, just they got a jeter and whatever, something that would smack them in the face and they got sick the next day. And so we don't know exactly why that happens, but it's very rarely an immediate response, which is not unheard of with weed. If you take too big of a bong rip, you might cough really hard and then vomit. That is not CHS, right? That is an acute response. CHS is a chronic cyclical response. And really, unless it's been going on for quite a while, like probably shouldn't be diagnosed. Like if a patient says, I've never had any GI issues, I've never had anything, we do a full medical workup and we can't find any reason, it would be silly to diagnose them with CHS. We probably should just call that gastroenteritis and just call it a wash. Unfortunately, some people might get labeled with CHS in that setting. But if this keeps happening, if this has happened before, it's been happening numerous times, like this is more of the CHS picture, not a one-off I got sick.
Of course. This is absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much for your research, for sticking your neck out there. For the people that are saying this is an internet disease, we have
Yeah.
already, I feel like, passed that. What what would you say to them? Can you just one sentence or two that I mean, people who smoke weed, we're supposed to be open-minded. Let's, reserve judgment for a fraction of a second. Because you're not an anti-weed person.
If this happened to your favorite, your best smoking buddy, how would you want them to be treated? Right? Inquisitively, open-mindedly, not shut down, you're a bad person or you're smoking bad weed, like not hostile, inquisitive, like open-minded to whatever this might be. I get why people are reserved. Cannabis has gotten a really bad rap for a really long time. Keep that passion, but don't think that it's perfect either. Like you keep open-minded to that for some people in certain contexts that too much THC can be a thing. And thank goodness, unlike alcohol that makes you act like an asshole, or benzodiazepines, which you can die of coming off of, right? This is the worst we found for cannabis, then we're still doing pretty good. But don't dismiss people's experiences. And unfortunately, I think we're doing that way too often with this plant or this condition right now. I would also say this is real. You don't have to look that hard. I'm a pediatric pharmacist. I work in the hospital. I see these kids who have nothing else wrong with them that are starting to vomit. I don't know what causes it. I'm not trying to even say that I know what causes it, but it would be pretty silly to look at a plant that one thing we confirmed no, whether it came from the dealer or came from the dispensary or came from a hemp online shop. We know that it's pretty rich in THC, and ignoring that completely, saying that THC is not a part of this, when we know it is probably the most abundant thing in all of the products that are being consumed, would be a pretty foolish take. Um, I don't know what causes it. Could it be pesticides? Yeah, I'm open-minded to finding evidence of that, but just saying it is, um, that's not an actual fight. So we're trying to figure out what can we do, what studies can we do to try to really pinpoint that this is not a dirty cannabis problem, and that's something we're kicking around right now.
Thank you so much. And any way we can support you, in the future, please be in touch and let us know because it's been such a pleasure to have you explain your research. And I think you're obviously changing a lot of lives. So I'm so thankful that you're making this accessible to everyone. And we can just approach CHS with a new perspective.
hmm And I'll link a source to the or give you a link to
Please.
the open source version of the paper. That it was originally open source, it is no longer, but that'll be probably in the show notes or whatnot. But if you want to see the final published version, maybe you shoot me a DM and we can figure that out.
We'll put a link to your information.
Yeah, perfect.
Thank you so much, Dr. Peterson.
Appreciate it, Catherine.
Thank you so much. Oh my God, you're
Yeah.
fabulous.
Oh, good.
Thank
Uh,
you. You're so good at explaining this. Really,
I mean,
really
explaining it, I'm a
fabulous.
teacher. That's what I do. I'm glad that you found it helpful. I felt like I was a little off today, so it's nice to hear that I did all right.
You absolutely perfect.
Thank you.
It'll go out next Friday. I'll send you a
Okay.
link, and then
All
it'll go
right.
on Substack on Tuesday. But I'll keep you posted on everything. I'm thrilled that you're doing this, and if there's any way I can help, please don't hesitate to ask.
Yeah, I appreciate you elevating our message and our study. This is what we're trying to do is just get the word out because the more people who know that this exists, right? Not
That's
that they
all.
have it, not that
Yeah,
they should change their behavior, the more people we can help. And literally already we just published with High Times today. I don't know if you caught that on
nice.
Instagram.
No, I'll take a look.
Yeah, it's a paper on it. And yeah, we got hate, but
Of
also in the
course,
DMs, you got people saying, "Oh my God, I think that I've been developing this. I think I'm in the prodrome and I haven't
exactly.
yet vomiting, but I've been waking up like this and I don't know what's wrong and I've been to doctors and I can't figure it out." And so like for every person who's gonna throw hate and say, "I've been smoking for 32 years and never heard of this," there's somebody quietly coming to us and
So,
saying, "Hey, this happened to
yeah,
me." Yeah.
and they just don't want to suffer anymore.
Yeah, and they don't want to be ridiculed on the internet. Like, who wants to argue with
Seriously,
strengers on the internet? There's
seriously,
some
it's
sick people out there, but like for in general,
exhausting.
nobody wants to do that. But you kind of feel compelled when you see it in person and it's being denied. So CHS sufferers who develop this often are trying to fight against this pushback on the internet. So you'll see a lot of discourse in all of these posts.
Can't wait.
And look, we don't have all the answers, but we need to start addressing the issue and not foisting it off on make believe stories about what it is. We need to dig in, we need to acknowledge that it's real, and we need to figure out what is it? What and how can we do better to slow it down or address it?
Absolutely. Well, you'll have to come on next time after you publish again.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.